Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like a young sailor sitting very, very still inside a steel tube, listening to his own breathing echo off the walls, while the sea ticks past a few centimeters from his face. Above him, waves slap against a black hull no bigger than a family car. Beneath him, bolted to the underside of that hull, is a live torpedo with a warhead big enough to tear open a cruiser. Once he releases it, there's a chance it will run free, and a chance it won't. The Germans had a name for this craft, Neger, after its designer, Richard Moore. The Allied sailors who met it at night had another word for it, a human torpedo, a one-way weapon that seemed to threaten its own crew, at least as much as the enemy. In this video, we're going inside those machines, the Neger and its diving successor, and the Marder. We'll look at how they worked, why volunteers climbed into these cramped, airless tubes, and why in the end they became symbols of a navy so desperate that it began to consume its own men for marginal gains. Let's start where these ideas really came from. By 1943, the German Navy was in trouble. The U-boat war in the Atlantic, which had once looked like a path to victory, was turning into a slaughter. Allied radar, sonar, air cover, and code breaking were chewing through submarines and crews at an industrial pace. Traditional surface ships were hemmed in by Allied air superiority and by fuel shortages. At the same time, the Germans had watched something that shook them. British X-craft midget submarines penetrating Norwegian fjords to attack the battleship Torpedoes, and Italian frogmen slipping into harbors on human torpedoes to strike Allied ships. If small teams in improvised underwater craft could do that to them, perhaps they could do the same back. Out of that mix of fear, admiration, and desperation came a new command. Kommando der Kleinkampfverbände, Small Battle Units Command. Its mission was simple and brutal: build cheap, tiny weapons that could be manned by volunteers and hurled at the Allied invasion fleets that everyone knew were coming. Human torpedoes, midget subs, explosive motorboats, combat swimmers, anything that might buy time with very little steel and a lot of courage. The simplest of these was the Neger. Technically, the Neger wasn't a submarine at all. It couldn't dive. Imagine taking a standard German G7E electric torpedo, then strapping a second, U-Livy torpedo underneath it like a piggyback. The upper torpedo had its warhead removed, and a small cockpit carved into the nose. A clear acrylic dome served as both windscreen and hatch. Inside, a single man sat at the controls, surrounded by batteries, switches, and not very much air. The numbers help make sense of what that meant in practice. The Neger weighed about 2.7 tons and measured roughly 7.6 meters long and just over half a meter wide. Basically a narrow tube. It could move at around 4 knots on the surface, with a maximum range of about 48 nautical miles if run slowly and carefully. At 4 knots, 48 nautical miles takes about 12 hours. 12 hours in a steel cylinder barely wider than your shoulders, half flooded, rocking in the dark, for breathing into a rebreather or limited air while you search for silhouettes on the horizon. The control room was brutally simple. The pilot looked out through the dome, aimed using a crude spike and scale sight on the nose, and steered with a small wheel and controls for speed. Beneath him, the live G7E torpedo rode in cradles, armed and set to run at a pre-selected depth and speed once released. A single lever in the cockpit would drop it away to begin its run. The Neger sat almost awash, just a low hump and a glint of plexiglass in the night. On paper, that made it hard to spot. In reality, it also meant that every wave slapped directly over the dome, streaking it with spray, oil, debris, and sometimes fuel from previous battles. And there was a catch. Several, in fact. Their early Negers had domes that could not be opened from the inside. Once you were sealed in and launched, you were committed. If the dome fogged or became fouled, you were effectively blind. If you tried to open it while at sea, water could flood in and swamp the craft almost instantly. Some pilots never even saw an enemy ship. They drowned, suffocated, or simply disappeared in the darkness, victims of their own side's engineering shortcuts. Yet there were volunteers. Who were these men and why did they sign up? Most came from the Kriegsmarine's pool of young sailors and trainees, men who had joined expecting to serve on big warships or ocean-going U-boats, only to find those ships sunk, fuel-starved, or confined to port. The propaganda machine painted the Kleinkampfverbände as elite naval commandos, heirs to the daring Italian frogmen and British X-craft crews. Special badges, special status, talk of decisive missions to stop the invasion of Europe. These were powerful incentives for bored, anxious, or ideologically committed young men. There was also fatalism. By 1944, many Germans understood that the war was turning against them. For some, that created a kind of desperate courage. If the Reich was going down, better to go down fighting in something that felt personal and heroic than to sit out the war behind a desk. Training was short and rough. Recruits learned to handle the craft in relatively calm waters, rehearsing launches from beaches or ramps, practicing navigation at low speed, and simulating torpedo releases. But there was neither time nor fuel for long, realistic exercises. That would show later in combat. Was the first real test came off the Italian coast at Anzio. In January 1944, Allied forces had landed near the town of Anzio, south of Rome, trying to outflank the German Gustav Line. The beachhead turned into a grinding, static battle, watched over by artillery, aircraft, and naval guns. Offshore, Allied ships lay at anchor, firing inland and supplying the troops ashore, a tempting target for small, stealthy craft. On the night of April 20th to 21st, 1944, 30 Negers were rolled toward the water for their first combat mission. It was a chaotic scene. Trucks, cranes, camouflage nets, men in life vests clambering over strange black shapes. Then the launch. 13 of the craft capsized before they even reached operational depth, or simply flooded when they hit the water. 3 more never returned at all. Of the remainder, but none scored confirmed hits in that first outing. German and later secondary sources differ over whether a couple of small Allied vessels were damaged in later Anzio missions, but even the most generous accounts speak of only minor successes. For the men inside, failure didn't feel like safety. Picture one of those pilots. He's been towed out to the edge of the anchorage by a conventional boat, then released to make the final run alone. The horizon is a jagged line of black holes and faint pinpricks of light. Every few minutes, star shells pop overhead, washing the sea in harsh white light. He checks his compass, estimates the range, lines up on a silhouette. Waves crash over the dome, smearing his view. His breathing grows faster in the stale air. Somewhere below him, batteries hum. Somewhere beneath those, a warhead waits. But he nudges closer, closer, counting under his breath. At a pre-calculated point, maybe 800 or 1,000 meters from the target, he yanks the release. If the mechanism works, the lower torpedo drops away and surges forward on its own electric motor. If it jams, the whole assembly might now be a live torpedo with a man glued to the top. This wasn't a suicide weapon in the formal sense. Unlike the later Japanese Kaiten, the design at least pretended the pilot might escape and return. But everyone involved knew the odds. One museum estimate suggests that roughly 1/3 of missions in these craft ended with the pilot dead from exhaustion, carbon dioxide buildup, bad weather, or simple mechanical failure. Still, Berlin wanted results, and Anzio was only a rehearsal. The real stage was always going to be the English Channel. When Allied troops stormed ashore in Normandy on June 6, 1944, they brought with them the largest armada in history: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop ships, landing craft, tank lighters, supply vessels, a floating city of steel. Somewhere in the woods near Honfleur, on the south bank of the Seine opposite Le Havre, a flotilla of Negers waited under camouflage nets, listening to distant thunder from the guns across the water. In early July, their moment came. On the night of July 5th to 6th, 24 Negers slipped into the dark and headed toward the invasion fleet. Each one carried a single G7E torpedo under its belly, with a warhead large enough to cripple a warship. In theory, that was 24 chances to punch holes in the Allied ring of escorts and minesweepers. In practice, the attack was a confused, terrifying, and costly affair. Allied ships were on alert by now. Patrol vessels swept the approaches with radar and searchlights. Aircraft roamed overhead. Anti-submarine warfare had become a science, and these tiny craft, forced to stay on the surface, were fragile in the face of any serious attention. Even so, the Negers scored their first clear victories. That night, 2 British minesweepers, HMS Magic and HMS Cato, were sunk by explosions attributed to human torpedo attacks. Only 9 of the 24 Negers made it back. 2 nights later, on July 7th to 8th, another 21 Negers went out. This time, the Allies were even more alert. Moonlight picked out small shapes on the water. Coastal radar and patrolling ships reacted quickly. Many of the German craft were destroyed by gunfire or depth charges before they ever got close. But not all. One Neger pilot managed to slip into firing position against the Polish cruiser ORP Dragon. His torpedo detonated under the ship, causing such severe damage that the cruiser had to be scuttled later. Another minesweeper, HMS Pylades, was sunk. The price was abysmal. Most of the attacking Negers were lost with their crews. If you've stayed with the story this far, and you're interested in these kinds of deep dives into the stranger corners of wartime technology, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. A like or a comment tells the algorithm to show this sort of long-form history to more people, and it genuinely helps more than it seems. Now, back to those one-man torpedoes in the channel. The Neger had proven it could hurt the invasion fleet, but only at shocking cost. It was also plainly flawed, and it couldn't dive, the pilot couldn't easily escape, and the simple act of operating the dome could be fatal. German engineers rushed out an improved design, the Marder. Externally, the Marder looked much like its predecessor, a long tube with a plexiglass cockpit near the nose and a live G7E torpedo slung underneath. Internally, a crucial change had been made. A small flooding tank was added in the bow, along with compressed air and controls, allowing the craft to submerge to about 25 meters for short periods. Crucially, the dome, which was also the entry hatch, could now be opened from the inside. It was still a tiny coffin of steel, but now a coffin that could duck underwater. The Marder was slightly longer, around 8.3 meters, and weighed about 3 tons. Judd had used the same 12-horsepower electric motor as the Neger and had similar surface speed and range. Submerged, it was even slower and had very limited endurance. The batteries and the man's lungs ran down quickly. In theory, the ability to dive meant the Marder could approach beneath the surface, pop up only briefly to observe and aim, then go deep again to evade detection. In practice, it was hard to control, especially for undertrained pilots. The bow tank could only handle shallow dives. The hull was not designed for serious depth, and the instruments were basic. Even with these improvements, one German analysis later noted that Neger and Marder pilots had to endure low speed, poor handling, extreme discomfort, and the terrifying possibility that the combat torpedo might fail to release, turning the entire assembly into a man-guided kamikaze weapon without ever intending to be one. One of the largest operations involving these craft came on the night of August 2nd, 1944. German small battle units launched a combined attack off Normandy. 58 human torpedoes and 22 explosive motorboats, attempting to break into the crowded Allied anchorages. They managed to sink a Royal Navy destroyer escort, HMS Quorn, along with a minesweeper and a landing craft. But once again, the cost was devastating. Around 41 of the human torpedoes and all 22 explosive boats were lost. If you zoom out and look at the whole campaign, the picture becomes even starker. Over the course of 1944, German human torpedoes, mostly Negers early on, then more and more Marders, operated in the Mediterranean and off the French coast. They launched dozens of missions. In return for hundreds of craft deployed and very high pilot casualties, they are credited with sinking roughly 1 cruiser, 1 destroyer, and 3 minesweepers, plus a handful of smaller vessels. From a cold, strategic perspective, that's a terrible exchange rate. From inside the cockpit, it felt even worse. Survivor accounts and later museum research talk about several recurring threats that had nothing to do with enemy action. Pilots suffered from carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide poisoning when fumes built up in the sealed, cramped hull. Their view through the dome was often obscured by spray, oil, or condensation, and there was no way to wipe it clean once underway. In rough seas, as many craft simply capsized or flooded. Some broke down far from shore, leaving the pilot adrift, half-submerged, in a black sea full of enemy ships and depth charges. And always, underneath, the silent presence of the torpedo. A standard G7E electric torpedo carried a warhead weighing hundreds of kilograms of explosive. It was designed to explode under a ship's hull and break its back. To sit directly above such a device, for hours, was to sit literally on top of industrial-scale destruction. If the release jammed, if a safety failed, if an impact fuse armed at the wrong time, the pilot's body would be the first thing in the blast wave's path. On the Allied side, the psychological impact was uneven. For high command, Negers and Marders were an annoyance, not a strategic nightmare. Just the invasion fleet was never in serious danger of being turned back by a few dozen slow, fragile craft. But for the sailors on individual ships, especially minesweepers and escorts patrolling the outer edges of the Armada at night, the idea of small, nearly invisible suicide subs crawling toward them between the waves was deeply unsettling. After the first attacks, Allied tactics changed. Patrol lines were pushed farther out. Depth charges were dropped more liberally at the edge of the screen, even when no sonar contact was confirmed, just to keep any infiltrators' heads down. Nets, more aggressive radar sweeps, and constant alertness made the already low chances of a human torpedo pilot's survival even worse. Interestingly, there was no major international legal controversy over Negers and Marders themselves. They weren't chemical weapons, they weren't flamethrowers, they weren't designed primarily to kill men in the water or violate specific clauses of the Hague Conventions. Instead, the moral controversy was internal. Was it acceptable to ask 19 or 20-year-old sailors to climb into these machines, knowing that many would die before they ever saw an enemy? For the Nazi leadership, the answer was yes. In their worldview, sacrifice for the Reich was virtuous, and the lives of individual sailors were expendable if there was even a sliver of hope to delay Allied progress. Human torpedoes fit neatly into a late-war pattern, miracle weapons that promised outsized results for minimal material cost, paid for instead in blood and optimism. By late 1944 and into 1945, more advanced midget submarines like the Seehund eclipsed the Neger and Marder in importance. Those could dive, patrol, and occasionally achieve respectable results with two-man crews and better seaworthiness. The one-man human torpedoes faded into a niche role, used in increasingly desperate coastal operations as the Reich collapsed. The idea, however, did not die with them. Italy had pioneered the human torpedo concept before the Germans, and Britain had developed its own versions. Japan took the logic to its extreme with the Kaiten, explicitly designed as a one-way, self-sacrificing weapon. After the war, navies didn't abandon the notion of tiny, man-carrying underwater craft. They refined it into swimmer delivery vehicles for special forces, focusing more on infiltration and reconnaissance than on ramming live torpedoes into enemy hulls. Modern equipment is far safer, more sophisticated, and designed with survivability in mind. But at its core, the concept is the same. A small team, or a single person, moving silently through the water toward a much larger ship, carrying explosive power far out of proportion to their size. When you step back, that's the strange legacy of the Neger and the Marder. On paper, they were almost comically crude, a torpedo strapped to another torpedo, a plexiglass bubble, a young man in a wool uniform, hunched over basic instruments, hoping his stopwatch and compass were enough. In practice, they were part of a broader story, how industrialized war tends, in its most desperate phase, to shrink back down to the level of individual bodies again. One pilot, one hull, one moment when a lever is pulled and a decision becomes irreversible. They did not win battles. They did not turn the tide. Yet for the men who built them, and especially for the men who climbed inside and sealed the hatch, these machines were the closest thing to agency they had left, a chance to strike back against an overwhelming enemy, even if the odds were terrible, and the design itself was their constant enemy. Pause for a moment and think about what that really means. In a war of battleships, aircraft, and mass bombing, some of the most dangerous assignments involved sitting alone in the dark, inches from the sea, riding on top of a bomb you could barely control, not because it was tactically brilliant, but because your country had run out of better options. Germany's human torpedoes, though the Neger and the Marder, are often remembered as suicide subs. That's not entirely accurate in a technical sense, but as a moral description it comes uncomfortably close. They were weapons that turned their own crews into expendable components in the larger machine of war. If this story felt worth your time, I'd really appreciate you leaving a like on the video and subscribing so you don't miss future deep dives into the stranger corners of military history. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think weapons like the Neger and Marder were truly more inhumane than the mass bombing and artillery that dominated World War II? Or do they just feel that way because they make the sacrifice so personal and close?